So hello, I'm Alyssa and together with Jamie, we're going to report At Home and Abroad, 20 contemporary Filipino artists, specific in the chapter Adrift in the Pacific, Filipinos in the Contemporary Asian Art Scene. So now first, we're going to the introduction. So this is a quote from the chapter which says, the Philippines is both a part of and apart from Asia. So Asia is considered the landmass which stretches north to south from the Arctic coast to the Malay Peninsula and east to west from western Turkey to northeast Siberia. So even though Asia is considered as one continent, we are not really bound together by anything except economic urges. So a lot of people think that maybe we have commonalities in our cultures which drive the Asia Pacific to be together, but mostly it's just economic changes or economic wants and needs. So in the 1990s, contemporary art has been the focus of a wide range of international exhibitions in which Filipinos have been duly included. So there's one question that was always begged to be asked. How does the unique art of the Philippines relate to the art of its neighbors in the region? Now we're going to tackle the influences in the contemporary art in the Philippines. Most first is the Asian influence from the early times to the late. So first is the quotation marks Asian period of Philippine history. So this Asian period is known to be the time of contact of the early Filipinos with its neighbors 25,000 years ago. Prehistoric times, the islands were populated by people coming from the Asian mainland. So the Asian mainland is now known as Taiwan. Then, thousands of years later, vibrant local culture was augmented by the Chinese traders who regularly arrived. So these Chinese traders regularly arrived since the Song Dynasty from the years 960 to 1280. And of course, the Arab traders who introduced Islamic religion to the Sulu Islands during the 14th century. So during the early times, the fragmented geography of the Philippine archipelago, meaning that we have 7,000 islands, that was not conducive to the early rudimentary cultural exchange with the Chinese, Japanese, and Korean. So that's why we only mainly interacted with the Chinese traders and the Arab traders. Now, the Filipinos' ancient ancestors, who were migrant mountain peoples and lowland farmers, developed their own cultural practices and productions, but were spread so thinly across the country, and the exchange never reached a critical mass before 1565. So in 1565, the Spanish conquistadors swept to imprint their European culture to the natives for almost 350 years. Thus, the practices that the ancient ancestors developed were overridden. So after that, the Philippines then entered the sights of the USA during the 1898 Spanish-American War. So after the Spanish and American occupations came 1942, which is the Japanese occupation. So the Japanese Imperial Army invaded and occupied the island for 3 years. Thus, Asian influence came back to the Philippines. So now the Philippines had come of age as a nation, meaning we have matured from being influenced by the Westerners for more than 300 years. But it had been attacked, conquered, and its values were threatened. Now, the Japanese occupation raised many issues about the Filipinos' place in Asia. So now in the present times, Japan, Singapore, and Hong Kong all have strong economic presences in the Philippines, but their cultural influences remain mediated by the Filipinos' strong cultural sense of self. So even though these countries have very strong economic presences and very strong influences in the present times, the Filipino strong sense of being one with their culture is still mediated or still being balanced by this. So now we're going to tackle the influences of the Europeans and Americans in the Philippines. So the European influence started in 1521 when Ferdinand Magellan discovered the islands and claimed them for Spain. In 1543, now a compatriot returned and named them Filipinas after the Spanish king. And after that, in 1565, permanent settlement was established, beginning the Catholic conversion in the Hispanic period. So an integral element of the Christianization process was the eradication of objects and practices of Filipinos from ancient and local cultures. So clear history of art in the Philippines leads back only as far as the 16th century when native craftsmen executed decorations for the church. So not much records are found regarding our pre-colonial cultures. So in the fine arts, during the 1850s, Manila had an officially chartered European-style art academy. So this academy had Spanish professors and reproductions of European paintings from the Royal Museum of Madrid. And now Juan Luna, who became the Filipino pride after being awarded in Madrid in 1886 for his works Palarium. So the Filipinos found meaning in this painting, signifying their struggles during that time. So it was used later on as a rallying point by Jose Rizal, who mobilized against the victimization of Filipinos by the colonizers. So in today's nations, Philippines is considered to be the most westernized due to these happenings, mostly in the fine arts and the 300-year European influence. Now, on the American influence, the US had direct political, military, and economic dominance, which started even after we became independent from the Spanish during 1898. So, the next topic we're going to discuss is the 20th century dilemmas or the present day dilemmas. So, modernism replaced academic realism in the early 20th century as the established international genre, which became a dilemma for progressive artists across Asia. So Asian artists found the foreign origins of forms like abstraction and non-objective painting lacking of links with native Filipino cultural traditions. During the 1950s, Filipino modernist painters looked at the Allied powers as guideposts to their own development to get away from the inadequacies of the art community. So many artists across Asia turned toward the international mainstream while still struggling to resist the dangers of an international style. So, Japanese art historian Masahiro Oshiro Shoji said that early modern artists of Southeast Asia sought their identity on a narrow path passing between the advanced art of the West and their own great native traditions. So the tendencies of nationalism and Orientalism were dangerous and seductive traps set along this road. The Asian artists of the 1990s are now seeking their identity in the social realities of today rather than in tradition, thus transcending the restrictive framework of earlier modern art in Asia. So it just means that today's Asian artists seek connections with the traditional art and culture of their ancestors, striving to develop a uniquely Asian approach to contemporary art making. Even Thai curator Apinan Posyananda points out that tradition should not be interpreted as the opposite of contemporaneity. Many Filipinos now are making strikingly original art which has benefited from a rigorous examination of their layered history, the complexities of their hybrid cultural identity, and the realities of their contemporary existence. Next, we're going to tackle islands, eternal time, and indigenous cultures. So the Philippines has over 7,000 islands, and indigenous cultural groups have practices and traditions linked to these lands they have inhabited for millennia. Approximately 60 ethnographic groups form 12% of the Philippine population, in which over 100 different languages are spoken throughout the country. So these ritual traditions confirm eternal cycles outside of Western notions. Over the past few decades, many artists have directed their energies in a concerted effort to piece together the fragments of ancestral patterns and practices. One of these artists is painter Benedicto Cabrera, who led the Tumawan Foundation in Baguio that preserved authentic Ifugao village houses. The next is the Baguio Artist Guild, who worked with native tribal groups and its members used indigenous materials and motifs. And lastly, the Black Artists of Asia were from Bacolod and supported Visayan culture and focuses on the feudal oppression of sugarcane capitalism. A part of this is also the Hanao Hanao Arts and Crafts, which was a weaving facility owned by Brenda Fajardo, and it had an initiative for community development in revitalizing folk culture. It perpetuated local patterns and techniques. During the 1970s, Filipino artistic exploration began to include gallery installations. So, these installations incorporated natural materials outside the realm of Euro-American modernist art. So, these materials include bamboo, sticks, stones, shells, and mud. After that, during 1991, the indigenous art movement was a major force in the Philippines. So, one of the indigenous art movement people was Virgilio Aviado. So he was one of the founders of Katutubong Sining, or the indigenous art group. So his colleagues felt an urge to end dependence on the West in terms of materials and criteria of art. And however, problems arose soon after. So the indigenous art movement, which was said earlier, was criticized by Alice Guillermo. She was saying that she had an issue with how artists added a bit of straw or weaving product from remote villages and fell into the easy solution of adding local color with just these small products that they added to their work. After that, Roberto Feleo, who sculpted Bukidnon Creation Myth in 1997, treated icons with a pop and comic touch. So he suggested animated heroes or toy action figures. After that, Gaston Damag combined past and present by making eerie, shadowy installations, including the bulols, which are if. So next, we're going to talk about the cultural traditions in other Asian art. So in countries like India, China, and Japan, centuries of cultural treasures are preserved and traditional arts are still practiced. But in other Southeast Asian countries colonized by the Western powers, indigenous practices were allowed to continue. So, artists across Asia must still confront the continuing foreign influences despite withstanding the impact of cultural imperialism. So even after the colonization of these countries, the different Asian artists still have to survive the foreign influences that came with it after. So the last topic that I'm going to discuss before I turn over to Jamie is the Catholicism, colonial history, and Filipino identity. So today's independent Filipinos are engaged in the daunting process of rewriting their pre-colonial history and reframing the effects of colonization. So Catholicism. In the present, 85% of our population are devout churchgoers. Though some of the artists call attention to the dangers of many Filipinos' blind faith in organized religion. So, one of those artists is Manuel Ocampo, who made paintings which mimic altar paintings and focus on medieval torture, the carnage of the Crusades, and the brutal devastation of the colonization process, as well as Alfredo Esquilio Jr., who was a hyper-realist painter and who examined the place of true spirituality and dealt with complex mazes complete with commercial and carnal temptations and televised apocalypses. Then on after colonization spread Catholicism, so it led over time to the formation of a national Filipino identity. And one of the prominent people was historian David Joel Sternberg, who stated that Filipinos have a sense of common identity, a feeling of bonding that has grown of the decades and centuries, and an awareness of a shared national experience and common past. So, 3 centuries of colonization literally changed the definition of the word Filipino. So, before, during the Hispanic period, it was a type of insular Creole, a Spaniard born in the Philippines. But during the mid 19th century, it was anyone who was born in and identified with the interests of the archipelago or the whole country, whatever his race, creed, or national origin. So another important person was Anna Fur, who considered the convergence of native and colonial cultures in her mural-sized painting India and Illustrada during 1993. So it was a painting which taken its subject as the land, the native villagers, and the educated elite who led the country to independence. Another person was Brenda Fajardo, who equally dedicated to historical and political themes. She also developed the medieval tarot card, which injected personalities and incidents from across the spectrum of the Philippine history.
So for history, culture, and nationalism in other Asian art, the influence from Japan. So from Japan, some notable people are Yukinori Yanagi and Yoshiko Shimada. They examined the general understandings of their country's past. For Yanagi, he explored imperial chrysanthemum, national flags, Japanese constitution, and the atom bomb. He also destabilized accepted notions of history. Shimada, on the other hand, he examined the role of the Japanese and other Asian women during World War II. And he addressed the comfort women who served as prostitutes for the Japan army. You can see their influence during the wars, the World War II, as mentioned from Yanagi, the atom bomb, and Shimada from World War II. Taiwan is Jui Chongyao, if I mentioned that right. He addressed territorial issues in Taiwan and throughout Asia, connected the self-legitimizing behavior of dogs and the actions of ruling cliques of power, politics, money, and privilege. Territory Takeover Maneuver Sequence 1994 attacked important military and political sites from the colonial history of Taiwan. Australia, there were lots of new generation Aboriginal artists. One of the mentioned is Gordon Bennett. These artists address the colonization of their land and historical horrors and current injustices. Engages conceptual art, photography, public billboards, film and video, performances and installations with conceptual postmodern approach. Gordon Bennett, as mentioned earlier, he did Possession Island in 1991. He layers traditional European printmaking, Jackson Pollock's abstract expressionist strips, the bendy dots of Roy Lichtenstein pop art, and the hand-painted dots of Aboriginal Western desert painting. So Gordon Bennett, he incorporated different mediums, different art styles, and he combined them all in this work of his that's Possession Island. He also deconstructed the invasion of Australian continent and the immediate subjugation of its residents. Contemporary culture in Filipino art, politics, pop culture, and urban populism. A notable person is Nunel Lucio Alvarado. He is an active supporter of the sugar workers in the Visayan Islands. He created stirring narrative oil paintings which emphasized the plight and started a t-shirt printing business for unemployed sugar workers to gain income. He basically helped the sugar workers from the Visayan Islands. He gave them new opportunities to find income, new opportunities to not stay in the work that they are doing because it doesn't give what they must have. So next are martial law babies. They came after the age of Marcos 1972 crackdown. They spent their youth active in the protest movement, learned art by making banners and murals. A group, Sanggawa, is involved in the early group Artista ng Bayan. They produced visual imagery for rallies during the Marcos era, also involved in the large muralist collective Grupong Saling Pusa, and it included Manuel Ocampo and Gaston Damag. These youths used art as a form of protest to voice out their opinions since a lot of mediums were limited back then. Some more notable people, Mark Justiniani, Elmer Burlongan, Manuel Ocampo, they cited their interest in early 20th century Mexican muralists like Diego Rivera, Jose Clemente Orozco, and David Alfaro Siqueiros. Particularly was resonated by Mexican muralists due to the shared colonial history. Since we were both colonized by the Spaniards, our art was influenced by their art, and therefore we have similar art forms that we do. And these people mentioned, Justiani, Berlongan, and Ocampo, were influenced by these Mexican muralists, which they applied here in the Philippines. Famous artists Fernando Amorsolo, George Pineda, Carlos Francisco, and Danilo Dalena are also book illustrators and editorial cartoonists. Josetense Ruiz, a political cartoonist employed by the syndicated Enterprise Service, addresses the cornucopia of issues for the Filipinos returning home, creates a never-ending cycle of balikbayan boxes made specially for Filipinos to ship personal belongings and purchased goods. Josetense Ruiz wanted to show the struggle of OFWs through his cartoon. Alvin Riamelio and Juliet Lea, they draw from the cartoon and add artists' arsenal of portraits, distorted expressions, and subverted slogans to create clever contemporary critique. Lindo Liana, in his time, made satirical pop-like paintings, pair caricatures of political figures with cleverly reworded recipes for favorite Filipino dishes to cause effect. Another strategy to catch the public's attention has been to use materials and images taken directly from the streets. So his artworks was directed onto the regime back then. For example, as mentioned, jeepneys, because it is the symbol of the Filipinos' journey into modernism, a folk art extension of their individual Filipino owners. A vivid way Filipino society has stamped industrialization with a native label. Next part, politics and contemporary culture in other Asian art. I'm not sure if I'm gonna say this right. Vasan Sithikat is a Thai painter. He created a series of large oil canvases expressing outrage in 1992 Bangkok revolts. Similar to the Filipino artists back in Marcos era, in the issues that happened in Bangkok, Bazan also used his art as a form of protest. Mixed traditional religious imagery and with politicians and protesters. Minjo. They are populist groups in Korea, emerged during their student revolts of the 1980s, aimed to develop a visual language that was immediate, spontaneous, and accessible among all Koreans. They took varied forms, including both aggressive condemnation of injustice and more peaceful, positive images of the lives of common people. So, similar to what was mentioned before, they used their art to rally against the government. They wanted to use this as a visual, so when people see what they made, they understand that it is against the government. FX Harsono is an Indonesian artist. He made eloquent installations in support of free speech in his country. The several mentioned mediums a while back were mostly painting, but FX Harsono used installations to protest for free speech. Use of popular imagery and street culture is pervasive in art from many countries around the world. In Asia, the use of contemporary cultural imagery is more complicated. Mass communication, often viewed from the Asia as a Western phenomenon, though easily and profitably embraced within many Asian countries and conglomerates. So in Asia, the art we made was very significant to the culture and was maybe taken in a way that it is religious for us or related to our deep cultures. So using art as a way to communicate your protests, it was very Western idea. So it was not really immediately taken up by these people, but it was embraced. Wang Guangyi, Wei Guangqing, Li Shan, and Yu Yohan are China's 1990s political pop painters. They mixed symbols from red communism and contemporary commercialism. Guo Qiangkai filled Western vending machines with bottles of Chinese herbal tonics and projects for European and American museums. A quiet rebuke against Coca-Cola. So his protest was against Coca-Cola. So herbal tonics are some steeped herbal that has medicinal properties. He filled the vending machines that was gaining popularity during his time to counter the Western European American views, and it was displayed in their museum. Jeong Hwa Choi, a Korean artist, found fascination in the space between Korean tradition and factory. He noticed the irony of the use of traditional Korean spiritual colors for cheap plastic household goods, which were once handmade for organic materials such as bamboo. Here he gave emphasis on how a deep culture was used into a cheap factory everyday thing when it should have been elaborate things that were handmade. But in their Korean culture, the colors that were very important to their culture was used for small things like everyday household things. So it's against that, and he expressed what he felt. Next part, Adrift in the Pacific, navigating out, navigating back. Filipinos have developed a special ability to navigate between homeland and foreign shores, greater ease and flexibility than natives of most other nations. It said here that Filipinos are adaptable and resilient to other countries. We can easily get into their culture and live as if we've lived there our whole life. Whether the impetus of migration is political, educational, or economic, Filipinos cover the globe. No matter what the reason why Filipinos go out of the country, it is a known fact that a lot of Filipinos are living outside of our country. Okay? This evolutionary adaptation to the waves of the Pacific and the tides of history proves valuable for survival and for inspiration. Other Asian artists address migration. Cheng Guangqi, he lived in Vancouver, Paris, Quebec, and New York. He made art on East Meets West series. It's a self-documented, tongue-in-cheek journey across America to significant culture, monuments, and tourist spots, dressed in a mouse suit and mirrored sunglasses. It was an art of him going around to the cities that he has lived in, and it was very light and fun, but it was significant to how I to portray how a person goes from a different culture from the East goes into the West. Masami Teraoka, a Japanese artist, he moved to Los Angeles and Hawaii. He merged traditional Japanese ukiyo-e style painting with Californian pop art. He creates raw visions of American culture through a Japanese lens. When he was in California, he merged two contrasting art forms. He moved to Hawaii, offered opportunities to observe his compatriots at play in paradise, and his new pictures comment on shifts in Japanese values while we're examining first encounters between Japanese and Americans. Is the postmodern, post-colonial future for Filipino art. From far outside the Western power centers has become more visible and more discussed during technological advances. Now, most basic assumptions about art, its practice, and purpose are being re-examined. Australian creator Bernice Murphy's speculation about the future of art. He said, if contemporary art internationally is to have a more vital function of cultural sustenance, then it must re-examine the terms of internationalism itself as a framework and aspiration for its highest endeavors. Art must seek conditions more deeply grounded and more vitally connected to the actual diversity and spheres of operation of difference in contemporary life. Art needs to regain its regional and local connections. Contemporary art needs to enrich its immediate sources and recontextualize its circuits of connection, while not surrendering its attention to the wider world, in which people are vitally implicated in the tasks of cultural survival. Filipino artists played a key role in the ancient contemporary art, the imperative to explore their connections to tradition, their interface with the rest of the world, and the future of their own cultural and national identity. These important local and regional issues are the resultant discussions that must be opened up for discussions, even amongst Euro-American, Latin American, Middle Eastern, and African contemporary arts, and not just the ASEAN region. Filipino artists did not only stay here in the Philippines. Their art is not only influenced by what is in the Philippines, but they went outside and not just limited to the ASEAN region, which has in a way similar art forms, but even the Western and the Middle Eastern, we must be able to open up to them what Filipino art is. Conclusion. In spite of this history in the end of the 1990s, Filipino artists find themselves now better prepared to participate in the global exchange about self, culture, country, and communication. Within the context of the postmodern, post-colonial world of the next century, Filipino art should fare quite well. So our art are now more globally competitive, even if the country went through tough times. Our art is emerging from not only staying on its roots, but giving up branches throughout the whole world, getting influences from different other cultures. And art, said by the authors of this book, can fare quite well in this thriving world. So thank you for listening to our presentation. This reading is At Home and Abroad, 20 Contemporary Filipino Artists, the chapter Adrift in the Pacific, Filipinos in the Contemporary Asian Art Scene. Again, this is me, Jamie Meneses, and Alyssa Facundo